Have you read any good books lately? Yeah, it's great to be reading books that really encourage us, inspire us, but also books that sharpen our skills. And if God has called us to serve in a particular area, it's so useful to read really good books that just are used by God to really sharpen our skills in that particular area. So I just want to talk a little bit about preaching, and it's with the hope that maybe there are some young and budding preachers, or maybe even some seasoned preachers out there for whom this can be helpful. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about preaching books, and there are just so many. It really is pretty much impossible to read them all. I just want to highlight how many books there are. You can get a book like Expository Preaching by John MacArthur and the Faculty of Master Seminary, Christ-Centered Preaching by Brian Chappell. I still haven't got around to reading this. I should. It's a book I'm definitely planning on reading this year. Another one I haven't read yet, Preaching for Revitalization. Picked that up at a book sale. There's just so much available. Warren Wiersbe's written a whole book on preaching and teaching with imagination. So he's just honed in on one particular facet of preaching and written a big thick book on that. So there is just so much to read, but I want to just get it to simplicity today and just recommend my top 5 books on preaching. And I'll say as a disclaimer, of course, this is subjective. Other people would disagree. Other people would have different favorites. But for what it's worth, these are the 5 books I would just recommend on preaching. And I'll share them in the order in which they sort of came to my attention. The first one is a classic, Preaching and Preachers by Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, who is regarded as one of the greatest preachers of the 20th century. It's one of the early books I read on preaching, and he really elevates preaching, the importance of it. When someone stands up to preach, it's a very important thing. Even the angels are watching, and so he really lifts up preaching and the utmost importance of it. So that book really does something to you when you read it. I would recommend that to anybody, Preaching and Preachers. The next one I came across is a thinner book, John Piper, The Supremacy of God in Preaching. A much quicker read, but really encouraging. I would certainly recommend that one. This one, Power Preaching for Church Growth. Power Preaching for Church Growth, subtitled The Role of Preaching in Growing Churches. And the author, David Eby, sort of comes out and says, look, there's a lot of talk about church growth, but not a lot of talk about how important preaching is in this process of churches growing. So he has a lot of quotes in there by famous preachers over the years, and that's certainly a good book, and one of those books that really gets you going. One I read more recently, I had to actually read it for a Bible college course, and I'm glad they put it out there, and that's Tim Keller on preaching. And his real emphasis in this book is the importance of preaching Christ. Doesn't matter what part of the Bible we're preaching from, to think about, how can I preach Christ, starting with this passage. So that's a big emphasis of this book. I found it easy to read, very encouraging. But if there was only one book I could recommend, particularly to a young preacher or someone who's just getting established and they want practical help, this is the one I would recommend. H.B. Charles. It's simply called On Preaching. If you watch some of H.B. Charles Jr.'s sermons, you'll find that he's really a fired up, passionate preacher. So we learn about preaching from watching men like that. But he's written a very simple book, and all the chapters are short. You can read a chapter in just a few minutes. He's kept it very simple, but covers a lot of material. So yeah, I would certainly recommend that one, simply called On Preaching. So yeah, any young men out there wanting to get into preaching ministry, or perhaps you've already got going and you just want to sharpen your skills, these are 5 books I would particularly recommend. What are some of your favorites?